This is the breakdown for my song Aqua from the All By Myself EP, which is out everywhere right now. Theoretically, you've heard the entire song already, so I'm not going to play it for you in this video, but I am going to go over literally everything I did to make the song. So the very first thing that I had down was not actually for the song in particular, but it's this chord progression right here. If I play the pattern real quick, you can hear it. So I'm not exactly completely versed in music theory yet, so I could not possibly tell you how I went about making that, but this is the chord progression for the entire track. I made it quite a while before I ended up actually starting on the song, so I made this chord progression maybe like 5 months before I actually started the song or even had the idea for the song, so it was just kind of sitting on my computer, and then I got the idea and decided to use this. So this is actually the very last song I made on the EP, so every other song was basically finished by the time I started making this one, and I kind of decided just to tack it onto the EP because I just wanted to make another song and I was like, yeah, I'm already coming out with something, might as well. So the actual initial conception of the idea for this song was just me watching these two Aftertouch audio videos and I was like, you know what, I can make a dubstep out of that, and so I did. And so with that, I went into making the song knowing it was going to have that kind of watery, magical aesthetic to it, which is why the initial project file is, you know, what it is. I don't think I can say that on YouTube, but you can sure see it. Since those two videos were completely based around sound design, I decided I wanted to sound design every single sound that you would hear in this song. And so in terms of at least the sound, it's definitely my most complicated song I have ever made. If I had the entire song all in one project file, which I don't, by the way, most of the stuff ends up getting rendered out. Like for example, in the final project file, everything you see here becomes stems. But if I had it all in one project file, that project file would probably upwards of 2 or 2.5 gigabytes, something like that. It would be quite a large project file. And so my computer wouldn't be able to run it. So I had to, once again, render out stems a bunch of times just to make sure I could actually finish the song. As you can see here, just the first part of the song, all the sound design I did for it, which is mainly just effects and whatnot, 145 megabytes. And that's just the first part of the song. So starting off, I isolated the very top part of the MIDI so I could use it as a melody and started with this initial patch, which as you can see, is already quite complicated. Unfortunately for me, this is a track breakdown, so I have to go over literally everything I've done here. This is gonna take a while. Okay, so first of all, I have this phase playing here. I think this is just kind of a layer, just to add some randomness to the sound. So I've got whatever this wavetable is, and I have that duplicated, and this one is just 1 octave up. The wavetable position is being controlled by this here, and then I have this on the gain, taking out all the low end. And then I use this a lot in this project file, by the way, just to add that watery sound. It is 10 dispersers inside of a snap, all at different frequencies, which just adds a semi-watery sound to it, which gets accentuated by this vocodex after this Serum Effects, by the way. So I have a higher and lower layer. These wavetables you can only get from buying a DAW Nation course. Oh, why do I have so much going on? Okay, I'm not going to go over everything, but you know. So I'm just primarily using this LFO to create quite a bit of movement, specifically in this band patch here to get that wee sound. And it is kind of a pluck, which you can see by this one here, which is controlling the volume. Of course, over here, that's reverbed out. That's also going through this vocoder, which gives it a very different sound. If I just run this here, that's how it sounds like initially. And then I have the secondary version of that, which kind of just sounds like a super saw. And I have an LFO on the sync just to add movement to the sound. Once again, there's some distortion and compression on that. And then that specifically is going through a vocodex just to change the sound's format. And I have that going into an EQ, taking out all of the low end, some of the highs, paired with this phase plan here, going through a Serum Effects, which I have a MIDI input so I can get the envelope working properly. And that's just on the volume and a low pass filter. And then I have another vocodex, once again, to make it sound more watery, some reverb, and this EQ. Then I've got that layered with another sound, which is way simpler. It's just a normal pluck. Nothing really special here besides the wavetable, which once again, you can only get if you buy that DAW Nation thing. I have those two layered together. So this is the higher layer, which is the one I was talking about earlier. This is the lower layer, which gives it some width. And then for this chord progression, I actually have two synths. One of them is playing the higher notes of the chord progression, and the other is playing the lower. So I'm pretty much using all of these, once again, purchasable wavetables, which have a very spectral sound to it. And then I have this being put through a spectral gate, which is a very interesting plugin. It does what it sounds like, it only lets certain frequencies through at a threshold volume, and then the rest of the effects are just to clean it up, make sure it has the right sound that I'm looking for. Same with all this. This Chamber Effects is kind of controlling the volume. It's not really doing much on this filter though. This is just a mid-side EQ if you ever see that, by the way. Then I've got that layered with this other synth, which is playing the lower half of the chord progression. And once again, I have those very spectral wavetables going on. Not much in terms of effects, just this chorus on this top one, and then on this one, it's basically the same thing. I think they're just oscillating a bit differently. This one looks like it's 12 semitones higher than the one below it. Once again, more EQing just to make sure it's got the right sound. Those together sound like this. And then I have another one with the full chord progression. I don't know what's going on with all this, but don't worry about it. Those are all layered together in one. So once again, that one's basically a super saw pad, and then together with those ones with the movement in them, it sounds quite full. I have another thing playing the chord progression as well. This is basically just an arpeggio, and instead of going in and manually creating the arpeggio, I've just put a bell into the phase plant granular synthesizer. This distortion is just making it a bit louder. Once again, making it a bit louder. This is taking out the high end here. I didn't want it clashing with the other chord carrying synths. And then I have some extra just background synthesizers just to add some extra spice, I guess, to it, like these bells. This is basically every bell sound I have. And that has the snap heap with a billion dispersers on it, some reverb, and some EQing. There's also this synth right here, which is once again basically the same thing with the bells, except I've got this frequency shifter on it, and it's playing just one or two chords from the chord progression. This is the first one, right? And the second one over here. And then it has lots of reverb and delay on it with this dual delay. No effects other than that on it. And then all these intro synths together sound like this. Going down to the sub bass. For the very intro to the song, I wanted it to kind of sweep in. So I have this sub drop going on, right? And this has the same MIDI as the bells, besides, of course, just being a sub bass. Just to give some extra interest to it, and then going into the actual synth itself. It's a very complex patch, but starting off in very basic terms, this stuff going on up here, which is connected to this morph EQ, is the growl of the sub bass, and then this just down here is the actual sub itself. It's just a sine wave with some distortion on it. So going through these here, this is just a saw wave with some mirroring on it. There are no effects on it initially. It's just to get some movement. This is not the same thing. This is once again another one of those prism wavetables, right? Because they have a lot of movement in them. And then I have those, once again with an LFO on it, just to get some movement, extra movement. This right here is to split the sub out so I can get rid of it, because I have this, once again, the sub down here. So everything else besides the sub from these two patches is going into a snap heap with the 10 dispersers and a vocodex to give it more of a watery sound. And then that's going through my typical growl processing, which is some OTTs and a fat rack, and in between those I have the morph EQ, which is basically just a high and low pass, and I also have this sort of peak going on. Once again, more movement, more valley movement. That's going into a serum effects, that's just a hyper dimension, that's all that's going on, and a mid-side EQ. I'm EQing that a little bit along with the sub, and then this is just to control volume. And this right here is controlling the morph path so it can sound cool. Also have a pitch shift once again for the sub drop. Pretty much all of these sub basses in this song are some form of growl. I think most of them, if not all of them, use a morph EQ to get that interesting sort of sound. These are all of the drums that I've got just for the intro. If I once again turn my sidechain on, and these I have all synthesized by myself. It looks complicated, but the gist of it is it's just a kick drum normal synthesis. I have a sine wave, which is going through a pitch bend, and that's paired with a little bit of noise with a very steep envelope to give it that transience. And then I have that layered with just this extra little sort of ping, I guess, just to make it sound interesting. Some transient shaping, distortion, a disperser just to get some extra low end. This disperser is only getting routed through this group right here, which is the extra sound, and then some compression and extra EQing. And that is being put in the key of my song, which right now is D. And then I have my clap, which is actually 2 layers, but I just have the clap here, right? Whose volume is being controlled by this curve, which is basically an envelope in Faceplant. This is how you make a clap, by the way. And instead of using white noise, I'm using all these very long river and or shower samples, so it can sound extra watery. And then on top of that, I have, once again, more watery samples to give it that kind of sound. Fading into that, I have, once again, more water samples, so it sounds all cool and whatnot. And then layered with that, I have a snare body, which is effectively the same idea as making a kick, except at higher octaves. And altogether, that sounds like this. Then I put those in this groove right here. This kick, by the way, is just the same kick from before, pitched up a little, and then I have it shortened. I also have a shortened version of the clap. And now we got this kind of sound, which I'm using for these cymbals. Once again, using those wavetables and more dispersion, pretty simple processing there. I just kind of slap that down in there. And then in the actual project file, I got some compression on it. And the main thing that's happening here is this delay. And then as we're transitioning from the intro to the break, I've got an effector on it, which is increasing in its effect over time. And it's a delay, giving that sort of sound, which you can do by just lowering the tempo, which I've got going on here. And then for my crash cymbal, I basically have the same thing as those other cymbals, except it's just a longer envelope. And it's got some reverb on it. So I have that both normal and reversed, swelling into each next crash. And there's just an EQ on it to take out the low end. And then beneath that is all the effects, which I now have to go over. This is where the sound design really takes off. So for the first one, I have both the wind impact, which is mainly made out of a noise, and then there's just a kick, and then I think I just have that layered with some distortion. There's a whole ton of reverb and compression on it, but it's just a whoosh impact type deal. Some EQing on it to take out some high end. And then I have that layered with this thing over here. I think it's using all the same envelopes, but it's basically just a bunch of bells. This once again has that 10 times disperser thing on it and 2 dual delays actually, just as a layer. Then what I've got going on here is I'm pretty much just layering a bunch of Foley on. So I have some glass shattering effects and this vinyl crackle just for some extra business happening. Okay, for this vinyl crackle, I have a Vocodex to get more watery sound, same. And this bin scrambler kind of it's a very interesting plugin, but it gives the kind of main sound that you have here, a very spectral type of sound, right? There's a delay on that and an EQ, and then I have that layered with these 2 glass effects, which is basically the same thing, more bin scramblers on them, which basically what the bin scrambler does is it's taking all the frequencies of the sound and kind of randomizing them. So it'll take like 800 hertz and put it at like 400 and so on and so forth for pretty much all the frequencies. And I just have reverb and some extra processing on that to make it sound cooler. And then I have this effect that I made. The gist of it is, once again, it's using those prism wavetables. And I have the speed of these LFOs increasing and decreasing over time. Same with the volume as well, just to get a sort of whoosh sound effect. I think I reversed this in the actual song itself. Yeah, I did. And then all together, those make the intro whoosh sound. Next, I have these ambiences. So first of all, I have this ocean kind of ambience, which is mainly using just a bunch of noise. And then layered with that, I have a very randomized sort of cueing sound effect. This randomizer I have on these envelopes, and it's basically just randomizing when they are triggered so I can make the sound do its thing. And then I have another one, this one down here, which is just wind. This wind stuff is very easy to make. It's just, these wind samples are really easy to make. It's just a bunch of white noise with a filter on it, once again, at random, this is the reason I like Faceplant, because I can use these randomizers at least a little bit easier than I can use in like Serum or Vital. And then I have a reverb on that. And then I also have this ambience. And then I have this ambience, which is made out of a bunch of weird stuff. First of all, I have this river, which I have, oh my god, okay, it's just made out of a bunch of weird stuff, okay? Just trust me. Just trust me. It sounds good in context. I've made a couple risers as well. This one is made out of a vital. I quite like using this inharmonic stretch option that came in really, really clutch for this song in total. But you know, it's just a riser, got some delay on it, so on and so forth. And then I've made a very stereotypical impact, which is just a kicking sound and some noise. And that's got reverb on it. And then this sort of downlifter, which is just made out of a ride cymbal inside of the faceplant sampler. I think it looks pretty self-explanatory to me. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the intro. And then for the break, this one was quite a bit simpler. I've got the crashes once again, and then I have these toms. Yeah, right here. A while ago, I put this drum set of just all of the toms I have into this FPC. So I've got those playing here. And then the main sound is coming from this vocodex and these 10 dispersers once again, except I have the amount on them turned down. And then there's just some distortion and some EQing going on. And then I put reverb on it when I put in the actual track, specifically from a Supermassive. This Supermassive I've been using quite a lot on the Great Annihilator preset. And then I have a low pass and high pass on it. Next, I have quite a large pad. Just got some EQing on it. This automation is for this thing right here, which is basically like a low pass. And how I made it, if I go in here, it's just this chord right here. What I basically got going on here is just it's just a bunch of water type samples with very random LFOs on them. And then those are going into this snap heap, right? And then that's getting vocoded to this chord patch here, which has the volumes of this lower and higher oscillator saw wave kind of phasing between each other. So when the lower one is louder, the higher one is lower, and vice versa. Playing one of the chords from the chord progression sort of as a transitionary chord. And then, yeah, once again, those get vocoded together, giving this kind of sound. And then that all is going into here. This OTT is just for processing, but what's mainly happening here is this massive reverb patch, which is just a delay, a reverb, and then a crystallizer going into another reverb to get some higher end. And that's this pad right here. And then I've got a different sub going on. This time it's a sort of respace. I have very similar processing. Once again, the sub is completely separate from the growly portion, which is just a respace. Once again, 3 OTTs, Fat Rack, and the Morph EQ. This is the Morph path, by the way. And I have even more effects. One in particular that I quite like is this sort of splash sound. It's just a bunch of water effects. So I have half of the water samples with this sort of filter going upwards. And then this other half with the filter going down, along with a frequency shifter to give it that sort of splash sound. And then I have this sound, which is sort of a watery swell type deal. Once again, made out of another phase plant. I'm using the same sort of idea for the wind, where I have a filter on some noise, and then I have this LFO on the volume of this water, which is being routed through some reverb, so it sounds all cool and whatnot. Gives it a swelling sound. And I have that layered in here. Then I've got this downlifter, which is right here, which is once again using all of those river and or stream sound effects. And I have the rate of this LFO being controlled by an envelope. That's got some reverb on it, by the way, and some EQing. And then for this riser, what I've got going on is basically my normal color-based processing, where I have a initial patch, which is a riser made out of those water samples. These are in granulators this time, and just some normal tonal rising stuff, which is just an upwards pitch shift on some basic wavetables and some extra processing. I also have a Combs filter and a dual delay just to make it more stereo wide. I have that passing through a vocoder, a resonator, and some extra reverb, along with very basic processing to make it sound like this overall. And that's the riser for this section. This is the build-up we're in now, by the way. And so with that, I have this extra chord patch, which is basically just a super saw patch, except I have the filters very specific to how I wanted the build-up to go. As you can see by these LFOs. along with the detune on the saws, and then they just have a compressor on them to make sure they're not too loud. Moving on to the drop, I've opened the second project file I have for this this song here, and I don't have much in this project file besides the sub bass and the lead for the first drop. So in terms of effects, I don't have anything extra yet in the drop. I don't think I made anything extra, but yeah, going over the lead for the drop. In the channel rack, it doesn't have any effects on it, but either way, I started off with this melody I thought up for the drop. Oh. And so this has multiple layers, just like most of my synths. As you can see right here, there was a reverb send, but I decided to cut that off. So just ignore this stuff down here, I guess. So what I've got here is 2 layers. One of which is the main sound. Looking at this is once again one of those prism wavetables. And I have 2 sine waves, which have the sync warp mode on at different octaves. Quite a bit of distortion and just some EQing to take out all the lows, some compression as well. That gives it this kind of sound. I also have a pitch envelope on them. And that sync warp mode is controlled by this LFO here, which increases the sync over time just to make it sound a little bit different. So as you can see, that right there has less sync than this one. And I have an ensemble to give some wideness and OTT and some EQing just to clean up the sound a bit. And then I have that layered with this one, which is more water samples. And that has a resonator on it just to make it tonal. And this is just as a sort of transient for the lead. Together they sound like this. And then I have EQing, of course. There's the stereo just depending a little bit to the right because it was kind of off. Some volume shaping, compression. And then I have sub bass for the first half of the first drop, which is once again another very complex sub. The actual sub of this is a really weird one. It's slightly different from what I would normally make. This is just the analog BD sine, so it's just a slightly different sine wave. I have it distorted with some noise, and I have the snap heap with a bunch of dispersers on it just to give some extra watery type noise. It kind of sounds like a fart, but just ignore that. And so I have that layered with the actual growl itself. If I just take the direct output of that so you can hear what it sounds like. Once again, one of these prism wavetables, a lot of distortion and some hyper dimension on it. This distortion is also giving it a kind of transient via this envelope. This envelope is also on the pitch, the coarse pitch here. And then I have some LFOs on both the wavetable position and this bend plus to give it some movement. And then that's going into a morph EQ, which has this crazy warp path. And then I'm taking out all the sub just with this. And that's going through both a vocoder and that snap heap to give it that watery sound, which both of those are mixed into a 3 OTT patch. And then I'm EQing out some of the high end, which can be taken over by this sub bass down here. And then I have this volume knob, which is being controlled by this envelope just to make sure I was getting the volume shape right. And then some OTT. This is the automation for that morph EQ, by the way. Just wanted a lot of movement in that section. So originally in this area, I had an issue with the chord progression where I had it pitched up by 2 semitones on accident just because I copied and pasted it wrong. So I had to redo pretty much the entire first drop just because I had the chord progression wrong. I ended up deciding to use that pitched up chord progression later in the track, and that's only because of the chord I used in the break, which is a very specific chord that just so happened to be working well with both the original chord progression and the one that was 2 semitones up. So when I went to the build up, I used the wrong chord progression, and yeah, I ended up using that later in the song. Either way, this is the next bass I have here. Which, as you can see, once again, very complicated, but let's go ahead and go over it. So the main patch is this thing right here. If I just solo it, it's this Atlantis table, which you can get from the Cymatics X-Fur Serum Starting Pack wavetables. It's just the second one here. I use it quite a lot. I have this LFO on the level. This one is on the wavetable position, 2 bars. This one, 1.5 bars on the bend minus. And then that just has a hyperdimension on it. That's going through 3 OTTs and 10 dispersers, and then into an EQ just to take out all the low end, because all the sub information is once again from that sub that I just went over. And then this is getting sent both through a resonator and vocoder. This vocoder has a chord input of this thing right here. This is the same wavetable, by the way. It's once again one of those prism wavetables. And I just have the wavetable position oscillating opposite of each other. There's just some OTT on it. This distortion isn't doing anything. It's not on. And this is on the level. It's going into this vocoder. And I have the modulator pitch shift turned down, actually, by 623 cents, just to give it a deeper tonality to it. I also have those chords going into this resonator, which instead of using the saw resonance type, I'm using the square, just to give it a different sound. I'm also taking the output from this this chord patch as a layer instead of just into the vocoder. And then all of these melodic elements are going out into an OTT and then through the 10 dispersers again. And then the entire thing is being routed into this EQ, which is then going into a patcher, just a mid-side EQ here. And then I have an extra reverb on top of that. And after that is when I finally named the song Aqua instead of, magic shit. And then after making that one bass, I decided it was going to take a lot of my CPU just to have that project file running if I created all of the basses inside of that one project. So I decided to start another project just for sound design for the first drop. And that's where this project file comes in. As you can see by now, everything is rendered out, so I don't have to worry about all of that. And then it might look like I progressed way too far here, but that's just because everything here that you see that is rendered out is from separate project files. First of all, I have my kicks. I'm actually using two different kicks just because of the chord progression in this area. Since I wanted my kicks to be tonal, basically the first half of the chord progression works well with the note G, and then the second half works with G sharp, so I decided to create two separate kicks. It's basically the same principle as before, except I have resonators on it along with this extra kind of ping layer, and I have two different ones. And then I have my snares. And snares are effectively the same thing as kicks, except they're quite a bit higher in pitch. And also, instead of using white noise for the snare, I'm using the water samples, so it sounds splashy and whatnot. And then I have a tonal layer as well, and I have two separate snares. And the second one is almost identical, except I'm using a square wave instead, and it's slightly higher. I also have this snare layer where it's just kind of snares pitching down. We got my hi-hats. This time they're made out of white noise and some water. Moving on to the actual basses. First of all, we have this one right here. Starting with this kind of sub drop. This is the sub itself, and then I have that layered with some water. And that's got some reverb on it along with all those dispersers. And then that's being vocoded to a supersaw, and all of it has some reverb on it. Along with that, inside Vocodex itself, I figured out that messing with these knobs right here can add some really interesting results. So I decided to do some of that. And then I've got this growl right here, which is pretty much the same thing as most of my color basses, except instead of just being, a growl with some vocoding and resonating, I have layered here water samples and some wind chimes for the growl itself. If I just go over that, just using this wavetable with just a little bit of noise. The bend minus is up, and then it's got a phaser on it, which is going all the way through the frequency range. That's going into a morph EQ, which is morphing, but I also have the shift, I believe, being used here, as you can see there a little bit, which gives it some really interesting sounds. I have that going into 3 OTTs, fat rack, some hyperdimension, and mid-side EQing, along with some extra EQing. This specific one right here, this specific EQ band right here, is just to make sure the high end isn't too much because of this morph EQ right here. So it's just for extra mixing. And then once again, that's going through some vocoding, some resonating, and then I'm layering the vocoder and resonator layer with the original layer as well, and then processing those all together. Once again, I'm also messing with that Vocodex just to make sure it has a ton of movement going on, which is what is most ideal for growls. Next bass, I believe I have another growl here. This is just a pretty normal growl, except I've got some interesting processing. For example, I have a Vocodex at half mix, and that's also being layered with some extra samples, just some more rain, for example. And then I have that layered with this weird shimmer drone from AU5 as well, which I have sped up quite a bit just for some extra movement. That also has a vocodex on it and the snap heap from earlier. These vocodexes and the snap heap are all just making these sounds watery. And then as per usual, I'm messing with the modulator pitch shift and the bandwidth for movement. Then I have this pretty odd patch, which is using, once again, those prism wavetables. Distortion, distortion, OTT. A bit different with this one. I think this one is just having the pew sound. So if I solo it, that's where that pew is coming from. And then this one just sounds weird, but pretty normal processing, OTTs, fat rack. This envelope controller is making sure it's following the right path. And then of course has some reverb on it, specifically through this Valhalla Supermassive. And then the snap heap to make it watery, and that is being layered with a vocoder and resonator layer as per usual. And I'm messing with the mix of that reverb as well. And finally, I believe this is another growl. Very heavy on the CPU, that one. Let me go look at it. Yeah, I can tell why. This one is going to be a doozy. I don't even know what's happening here. Jeez. Okay, it looks like this is the growl right here, I believe. If I could just solo that. using those prism wavetables. This is pretty much the same thing as prism wavetable, distortion, and the Atlantis wavetable. I have this LFO on the wavetable positions, and the bend minus is up all the way for the Atlantis wavetable. This is going through the morph where I'm shifting the morph and the shift knob. Normal growl processing, 3 OTTs, fat rack, EQing, yeah, hyperdimension, and that's being layered with a vocoder layer, which is made of both a super saw patch and a secondary patch, which has nearly the same processing. This one has a phaser on it just because I wanted some extra movement. Once again, vocodecs, and not only are they being used as a vocoded layer, but they're also going through by themselves, and that overall gives this kind of sound, which if I go over to the project itself, you can actually hear. I don't have very much extra processing there, just some EQing every once in a while and some compression. Except the lead that I have now has a reverb attached to it, so I can do some reverb swelling. And then I have the drum pattern up here. For the first half of the drop, I don't have any kicks layered with the snares, but for the second half I do, just because I want it to be ever so slightly heavier. As you can hear, compare that to this. And instead of using the original sub, which was just a tad too short, I decided to render that out and lengthen it a little bit. And just some EQing on the sub bass to take out all the high end. Onto the second half of the first drop. As a transition, I have the original first bass transitioning into this one here, which I will go over the sound design for now. Also for this section of the drop, as you can see, if I pull down the chord progression itself, I have the chord progression half-timed, just because I wanted this part to be, you know, the calm. If you've seen my original color bass tutorial for It Begins, I was going to have a calmer section, but then I just didn't end up doing that. I don't know why. So I decided to do the calm in this song specifically. I have a phase plant patch for this first bass, which is just a cymatics pew sound I found, and it's using the same technique as that ride cymbal downlifter, where I'm increasing the length of the sound over time, so it has that, so it sounds like that. And I have 2 of those being layered together, one of which is going through this processing here, where it has the just dispersers on it, and that's being layered with a dry one, and then all of those are going into transient shaping and some compression, and then that is being vocoded with just a super saw. And then once again, I'm shifting all of these knobs here, right? And then I have a second one. And then I have a second one, which is just duplicated from here, which is following the groove of the second half of the drop. And it doesn't have anything on the length of the sound. So it's just a normal pew type sound. And that's getting high passed because it's not the main layer for that section, which is this one down here, which is a very interesting sound in my opinion. First of all, it has this watery layer here. And then layered with that is this one right here, which is just a couple of sine waves and some distortion. Those are both going through an OTT and are being split between just going straight into the morph EQ and going through a vocodex. Once again, I'm changing the parameters on this vocodex just to give it more movement. And then this morph EQ has a ton of movement going on because I just wanted it to sound weird. More OTT going through this EQ, try to boost the high end. And then that is vocoded with this super saw here to give it that sound. And then layering that with the initial pew to give it some extra transients, right? Then I've got this sound. By the way, over here, I don't have any significant processing. It's just some EQing and compression, so not worth going over. Back to this next bass. This is a very scuffed bell sound. It's the same bell sound I used before, if you remember that, but it's also got these really weird sine waves, which are being pitched up and down. That's going through a frequency shifter as well to make it even worse. And then I have that going through a vocodex and an OTT, and then parallel processing with that snap heap with the 10 dispersers. And that's also being vocoded with some super saws, or I guess super triangles in this case, since I didn't want it to be too high-endy, I guess. Once again, messing with these knobs. That has a TDR Nova on it just to make sure the high end is not too excessive, and then some EQing. And that is also layered with this pew sound. And then I have some interesting stuff going on with this low pass here, just to give it an interesting sound. Or different chords are being layered with this now. And what I have down here is the sub bass, which is being controlled by this P controller. So it's perfectly lining up with the drop basses that I have. and then I'm taking out some of the high end. And then what this essentially is a sub bass, just normal sub right here. And then that's being layered with another sub bass, except this one has a down sample on it, whose amount is being controlled by the note modulator. So it's a different sound depending on what note you're playing. And that has an ever so slight amount of reverb on it. And then of course I'm taking out all the sub from that area. I don't know why the retune didn't load, but it's supposed to have a retune on it, which is basically like a pitch map. Anyways, with the second half of the drop basses, I have this very specific patch here, which is using a high end and low end reverb. And they're kind of phasing through each other with this formula here. So when one of them is loud, the other one is quiet, and vice versa. And then the level of reverb is being controlled by this one here, and the tone of the reverb is being controlled by this one down here. So when it's higher like this, it has a very high-end reverb, and when it's lower, it has a low-end reverb. So I can do some cool reverb swells in this area, and then just a compressor on all of them. And for the drums, I made my own custom drums once again. This is the kick right here. I did some extra processing on it, but I think you get the idea. It's a pretty normal kick. And then for the snare, I made something really weird where I've got a ring mod on it, and I'm also using a square wave instead of a sine or triangle wave, so I can make it sound extra weird. And then the noise layer for the snare, and then the noise layer for the snare has a filter envelope on it, and then just normal snare processing after that. So the snare is really funky. And for the hi-hats, I have this kind of weird thing, which is yet another pew type deal. It's a pulse width with the sync on it, and then I have a very transient envelope on the pitch right here, and that's being layered with another water sample, except it's got some noise layered with it, but it's not just normal white noise, it's this sort of quantized noise right here, and that's got some distortion, some dispersion, and a ring mod and a frequency shifter on it. And then I have that adjacent to this other one, which is basically the same patch, except I think I have the ring mod frequency different and also the frequency shifter frequency a bit different, so something like that. Oh, this one also has a band filter on it. And if I go over here, you can see I've put a filter on it just to follow the flow of the drop. Actually, I think I was lying. So the hats I was just talking about were not actually hats. They were just this extra percussive layer. As you can see right here, it just got some OTT on it, and then this thing right here. And then I have this weird percussive layer, which is this right here. This is made from pretty much the exact same patch as that snare that I made, except the ring mod frequency and the frequency shifter frequency are a bit different. And is following the flow of the drop. And then if we go over to the thing here, right, it's got a ton of effects on it. There's a peak controller right here. I don't know what that's for, to be honest, but these are kind of just cleaning it up, and then have a pancake on it to pan it left and right by an amount. I'm gonna be totally honest with you, I have absolutely no clue how I made these hats because they are not here anymore. But you know, it'd be like that sometimes, right? Along with that, the sidechain I'm using is quite severe. As you can see for the kicks, it's completely cutting out just because I thought it sounded interesting. And then I have a reverb swell out as we get into the second break. Hopefully I've taught you all well enough on that part, because we are going into the second break now. So first thing I made here was this sub bass here. Once again, it's a growl variation just with a sub bass on it. I'm gonna mute this part real quick. If we look down here, here's just the sub bass again. It's just a sine wave at -3 octaves with full tube distortion. I pretty much do that for my subs every time, and then sometimes I add, you know, an EQ just to boost some low end, but I end up doing that in post-processing. Either way, main thing is right here. So what I've got going on here is once again very typical growl processing after this morph EQ, which I am using both the morph and the shift right here. The morph is very linear, it's just going up and down over and over again. And then I have the shift kind of literally just clicked in randomly just to make some cool sounds, you know. I'm actually going to route out of this parametric EQ so you can just hear it straight up. And then after that, 3 OTTs, Fat Rack, and then a hyper from Serum Effects. That's going into a kilohertz compressor just to make sure it's not too loud. And then on top of that, I have a low pass kind of fading in and out just because I thought it sounded cool, which is controlled by this EQ curve here. And then the original sound itself is this right here. It's once again one of these prism wavetables. I'm not sure why this is on. It doesn't do anything clearly because it has no effect. But I have a very slow LFO on the inharmonic stretch and wavetable position of this brown noise, and same with this additive squish wavetable, which these are both stock Vital wavetables, and then I have them high passed. Or I guess the first one high passed. I'm not sure why I didn't high pass the other ones, but some distortion and multiband compression after that. All of this just because I wanted as much movement as possible within the bass to make the break as interesting as I could. And then after that, I have an EQ boosting the lows and a Valhalla Supermassive with a transition from the break to the build up, as you can see by this right here, Moving on, I have a pad, and this pad is playing the chords for this section. This first chord here is, I believe, the exact same chord as this, this big old pad over here. And I use that as a transition because if I remember correctly, earlier I mentioned that when I was getting into the first drop, initially I accidentally shifted the MIDI for the chords, I think down by 2. So I decided it would be a cool idea to do that on purpose within the second drop. So I'm using this whole chord progression right here, just these first 16 bars, if I just highlight those, as a transition from the original chord progression to the chord progression now 2 semitones down. So I have that one chord from that pad over there. And then these 2 chords are from the original chord progression, I believe. And then these 2 chords are from the pitch down chord progression. And these are just transitionary ones. I am no music theory expert, so I don't know how all this fits together. I just know that it sounded good when I clicked it all in. I'm sure one day I'll be able to explain what I did here, but for now, until I learn music theory, you're just gonna have to trust me. It just sounds good. And to actually make this pad, it's really simple. Just a bunch of sine waves, each one octave higher than the other one. So this one's the lowest octave, and then I have another one and another one on top of that, and full distortion, full tube distortion on that. Going through a Valhalla Supermassive, the Great Annihilator one is the one I use the most because it just has the fullest sound, and usually I turn the warp up all the way and the density up all the way. I'm not sure why I don't have that here. And just some EQing to take out all the highs and all the lows, and that gives a nice, soft, and warm pad. I have no extra processing on that, by the way. And then on top of that, I have the kind of lead for this section, also kind of playing chords, because I wanted to add some extra transition from the first drop to the break. I just have a single note playing from this lead before the break. And this is effectively following the chord progression I have down in that pad. Just with significantly less notes of the original chord progression, going down to actually look at it. So what I've got as the main sound here is this Vital, in which I'm using just stock wavetables from Vital. One of these is an octave lower just to give some bass to it, and that's got some, OTT on it, and I'm just making a pluck out of it. And then I'm running that through another OTT and a kilohertz ensemble to give it some stereo width. That's what it sounds like by itself. And then I have that layered with another thing, which is a very harsh one. It's just one sine wave, but I have it heavily distorted. I actually have the sine wave muted, but those are both going into another Valhalla Supermassive, this time with 100% density and warp. I have the mix all the way up because I'm doing parallel processing, and the delay is very high because I wanted to have a long reverb. And then that reverb is going into this EQ to shape it up a bit, and this is what it sounds like. And the next up is all the effects I created for this part of the song. This ocean ambience is just for the second half of the first drop. I imported it from earlier. I think I already talked about that though. First of all, I have this riser turning all the effects off. This Vital up here isn't doing anything. It's all this one. Pretty typical riser effects. I just have a stock wavetable and I'm putting this 2-bar LFO on it. I'm not sure why it has the FM on. I believe that was with this one over here. Either way, I've got the inharmonic stretch on it, and I'm also increasing the volume and pitching it up over time. Also messing with the wavetable position. I've got this also on a high pass, and then just some chorus and OTT, and then that is going parallel processed twice through a spectral gate, which gives it this sort of like low pass type sound because it's only letting the loudest frequencies through. And then I have that going through a bin scrambler, which effectively takes the frequencies and kind of randomizes them, which gives it this pretty cool sound. And then those are all being layered together. And then for the effects, I've got this fruity balance just to turn it down, OTT, taking out all the low and high end. I'm putting some hyperdimension on it, and then just some fruity reverb. Next is this whoosh. So I have this cymatics recording of a shower, and I have a volume envelope on it, and then I have for effects, I've got just a mid-side EQ. This is also going through a spectral gate and bin scrambler. So what I've got going on is, first of all, it's going through a vocodex just to make it more watery. That's going through an OTT, and then I'll talk about these fruity balances in a second. And then it's also, if I just go over here, it's going through a bin scrambler and spectral gate, which I explained earlier. This one randomizes the frequencies, and then this one only lets the loudest frequencies through up to a certain threshold. And basically what this formula controller is doing is that when I turn this knob, one of them gets turned down in volume. That would be this watery patch down here. And then the sort of metallic one gets turned up. And then I've got an OTT after that, taking out the lows and highs and just a reverb, which is controlled by this one right here. I have a kick impact. I created just a very stereotypical kick with a serum. I'm pretty sure I've already gone over how to make kicks in this video, but just a sharp envelope on the pitch, and then kind of this envelope on the level, quite a bit of tube distortion that's going into this effects rack here, which is just a Valhalla Supermassive. Once again, a great annihilator to give that kind of reverb. And then I'm not sure what this EQ is here for. It's not doing anything, but you know, kick with reverb, impact. And I have that being used here. There's also this atonal sort of impact right here. Pretty simple processing. It has a Valhalla Supermassive on it once again for the reverb, so I can make it an impact. This one has an EQ on it, taking out the lows and highs and going into the actual patch itself. Semi-complicated, but it's actually not. This up here is just the noise layer. If I turn that off, and actually if I turn this to 0%, it's just a pluck, and I'm using those Prism wavetables. That's going through a disperser, or a couple dispersers, and a dual delay, and then just an EQ to take out all the lows. 100% reverb. Pretty cool, and that's right here. Next up is this chord stab. This is just a super saw pluck with about half a reverb. Once again, this Valhalla Supermassive, I use that a lot. And then this is a high and low pass. You can't see it because I just have it all the way down, and that has no extra effects on it. And it's just playing the first chord of that chord progression. You get the idea. And then halfway through the break, I have this kind of, that thing. And I guess I just reused whatever I had for that other impact, except I muted the pluck, so it's just the noise layer. And then I have two triangle waves, one an octave above the other, and that's just getting pitched down by one semitone. And that is also going through a Valhalla Supermassive, so it sounds like this. And that's it for that section. Continuing on to the build-up, I have a different sub bass going on here. This is a pluck. What I've got here is just a saw wave pluck that's going into this morph EQ, which is a very long morph path, since most of the movement is just coming from the fact that it's a pluck. This is sort of high and low paths, typical processing, 3 OTTs, fat rack, and that's being parallel processed with just the normal version. Those are being combined within this EQ just to take out all the low end, because I'm getting a sub bass in here, which is a bent saw wave. And then this sharper envelope is on the coarse pitch to give it some extra kick. That's got full distortion and some OTT. And those are all going together into this patcher, you know, 3 OTTs, a fat rack as per usual. Then I've got a snap heap with a couple less dispersers just because I didn't want it to be too dispersed, too watery. But these just give it some extra beef. And then I'm taking the sub out and taking everything else into a effects. Once again, more plucks right here, more pluckiness right here, because I guess if I turn that off, it's going to sound quite a bit different, but I wanted to take out some of the high end there, and then some hyperdimension. And then I have a couple of these kind of LFOs throughout both this patch and that patch. What they're doing is just kind of raising the cutoff of some of these plucks over time. So as you can hear, it starts pretty low. There's not a lot of high end, and then as we get to the drop itself, all the high end is no longer being cut out. So sounds cool. Anyways, moving on. I have this pad. It's still here. It's playing the second chord progression, which is the one pitched down. And then that's being paired with these chords now, which are just some pluck chords, doing pretty much the exact same thing as that sub bass down there. They're basically super saws. And I have, once again, that longer LFO just to effectively decrease the cutoff and give it more energy as it goes from the start of the buildup to the very end. That's what's happening with these here. And I have the reverb increasing over time as well. And I have a high pass and, you know, an OTT on it. And also over time gets more detuned. And once again, it's playing that secondary chord progression pitched down by a couple. On top of that, I now have this pluck here playing fewer notes. Semi-following the chord progression, just the top notes of the chord progression, and then some chords here just to make it sound interesting. And then paired up with that, I have another lead, which is just a sine wave with a ton of distortion, hyperdimension on it, which is getting more detuned over time, and also increasing the mix of the hyperdimension. I have an EQ on that to take out all the lows and just some of the extra piercing high end, and then of course a reverb, and that has no extra processing on it. And then that is going through a EQ here just to take out more of the low end, just to make sure that, you know, the distortion is not doing anything bad. Now I've got it playing a slide melody, because this has some portamento on it, just a little bit. And beyond that melodic stuff, I've got some effects. You know, the wind ambience is no longer there because I have it replaced with a couple of stuff. I'm bringing this kick impact back along with this impact here. You know, that one. Then I have a couple extra ones. First of all, this wind whoosh type deal, which once again, I'm pretty sure I already talked about it, but wind is really easy to make. You just get some noise and put a filter on it. This one is on the volume here, and then this one is on both of the cutoffs, and that's got some reverb, and I'm taking all the low end out of it. So that would be this whoosh right here. Then I have another one. which is just using stock Vital wavetables. I have this longer LFO on the first one's wavetable position, and then this one on both of the levels, and this inharmonic stretch for the second oscillator. These are all at negative 36 semitones, by the way, and then they've got a filter on it, taking out the high and the low end, multiband compressor, and just some reverb, and then an EQ to take out all the lows, and that would be this one right here. The next one is actually quite a large one. This is a wind sample type deal where I have it kind of low in terms of the volume, and then it increases in intensity from, this would be the break into the build-up. So first up, I have this fire sample, and I'm putting, high pass on that Skill Hearts gate just to only let some of the sound through. Vocodex to make it sound weird. If you turn the bandwidth all the way down, you get a very specific sound, which is a similar sound to what this bin scrambler is also doing. Once again, randomizing frequencies. I have an OTT on that compressor, serum effects to give it some wideness. This peak controller I'll talk about later. I don't exactly know what it's affecting right now, but I'll find out. And then high and low pass. And then that's getting routed into this one right here, which is OTT high pass. I'm turning it down in volume, crystallizer, and delay to give it more space. And that's being layered with this shimmer drone from an AU5 pack, which sounds like that. And here's where this comes in. The volume of this is, the peak controller volume of that is controlling the volume of this shimmer drone via the fruity balance that I have here. And then that is going through a compressor just to make sure it's not too loud. And then that's also going into this one right here with the OTT and the crystallizer and delay and stuff, just as an interesting background layer. Now on top of that, I have the wind noise itself, which is made in Vital. And then on top of that, I have the wind noise itself, which is made in Phase Plant. Actually, I have two. One of them is a lower layer, which you can get by getting this and just turning the slope all the way down, which takes out all the high end out of the noise sample. And then I have a randomized oscillator on the cutoff here because it's wind, it's not exactly consistent. And then I have a higher version, which is pretty much the same thing, but just higher frequencies. And then these are increasing over time. There's more reverb. I'm turning the frequency of change of those random LFOs upwards over time, so it gets more chaotic. And I'm also bringing more high end with this low pass here, and then just a mid-side EQ on that. Once again, I already mentioned the reverb, right? Well, that's there, and that's what this one is right here. It got a little bit too loud, so I had to turn the volume down just to be a little extra consistent. Next up, I have these two final effects that they're the last effects that I made for this song, which is this tonal riser and then this retuned G major thing, which I will show you now. First of all, that G major thing. Basically what it is I have two sine waves. Both are pitching up over time. One is pitching up less. That's got multi-band compression on it, a high pass, and some reverb. And then that is going into a retune, which is effectively a pitch map in G major because that was the closest key to whatever I was doing with my song at the point. And yeah, it sounds pretty cool. And then I have this thing right here, this is just yet again another wind type sample. It's increasing in volume, and this peak here is also going up over time. This MG low 6 is just to take out some of the high end because it was a little harsh. And then I have hyper dimension on it to make it wider. Just a pretty typical noise riser. And then I have that layered with these super saws, which is pretty much the exact same patch, except that, just have saws here. And then those are both going into OTT, a Valhalla Supermassive, and an EQ to take out all the low ends and dampen some of the highs, giving us a nice riser. And this is what it sounds like in context. I have an envelope volume on it as well. Last thing, I have a reverse crash cymbal over here as well. Starting off with the first half of the second drop, I'm just going to turn my sidechain off here. I have effectively the same sub bass as before, just playing the groove I wanted for the second drop. Effectively what I did here was just take off those longer LFOs. As you can see here, it's not really active on much. Once again, it's almost exactly the same patch, except I have a frequency splitter here, just taking out the low end and routing that directly into FL Studio. And then I've got a serum effects on it, just with some hyper dimension, and then once again an EQ to sort of, make it more plucky. And I have the MIDI being routed into the serum effects so I could use an actual envelope, so I wouldn't have to manually do this automation. It would just trigger whenever a note triggered. And then I have the morph EQ going a lot faster. This is just using a wave automation type, and that's all that I have in this specific project, so I'm going to go to the next one now. Along with that, I have a separate project for the sound design for this section. First of all, so I've got the original kick here that I made. It's just a variation on the first couple kicks that I made, so nothing really special here. This entire lane 2 is completely off, or it's not, nothing's running through it, so this resonator doesn't really matter. I can just shut that off basically. And then I have that resampled into here, where I actually do have some effects on it. I have a compressor. I'm taking the high end out and putting a transient shaper on it along with an EQ. I've got another EQ just to boost some lows, you know, just shape up the sound a little bit, and then a disperser, which if I turn that off, completely changes the characteristic of the sound. So I just wanted to bring out that low and a bit extra. That gives it that kind of sound. I have just a little bit of distortion with a Camel Crusher, and then a fruity soft clipper just as some limiting, and then another EQ to shape up the sound ever so slightly. And that is my kick for this area. And then the snare here, which is pretty much the exact same snares as before, except I'm just not doing as much. Once again, there's this tonal layer, and I'm changing that for each fourth of the drop, because this first fourth works with the note G, and the second fourth which works with G sharp. So these are almost exactly the same snare. I just have it pitched a little bit differently. Once again, same snares as before, so I'm not going to really go over them. And then I created some ride cymbals, which I believe are basically just a crash. Probably that crash right there. Just, I don't even know because I don't have the full thing. Let me actually look at it. So what I've got going on here, just some very typical processing for cymbals. I'm taking out all the low end and just boosting the high a little bit. And then I have it normalized and shortened, because without that, it sounds like, you know, it's just really small. So turning that up gives it that kind of sound. I have these hi-hats. Don't remember how I made them because, you know, they're not in this project file anymore for whatever reason. But I'm pretty sure all my cymbals come from pretty much the exact same patch. So you can guess how I made these, I guess. And they are playing the same rhythm as that sub bass from earlier. I just have them slowly panning from left to right over the course of 2 bars at 40%. And then this EQ is just turning it down ever so slightly. Next, I've got some open hats. Once again, pretty much the exact same patch, just shorter. And then, you know, taking out some low in there. Yeah, just some shaping up with the in and out thing right here. Then I've got some crash cymbals. This is actually, for certain, this crash right here. So if I go into the patch itself, this is just basically white noise with a ring mod on it and, you know, some frequency shifting, a little bit of distortion, and taking out some of the low end. This has like an envelope on it as well. I can just find the thing that's actually controlling it. Yeah, this one here. And then that is going through an EQ, taking out all the low end. That's also going through this vocodex with the bandwidth very low, so I can get that sort of sound. And then that's going into this delay with the difference amount, with the diffusion amount and size all the way up. I have the time all the way up as well. So that's getting a long reverb. That's going into an OTT and another EQ, boosting the high end a little bit. And that's this crash right here. I have the reverse as well. And then my side chain. Moving on, I have the chords from the build up. This one right here, double timed, and I have a ever so slightly quieter patch. It's the same one as before. I think I just turned it down a little. And then once again, I have the sub bass. I just changed a little extra, like over here. I have this kind of, I don't even know what to call it. It's like a sweep in, I guess. And then I have the volume of that being changed over here from the first drop to the second drop. That'll make sense later, but going on to the basses, I'm going to go over here where I have the actual patch itself. So all of the basses in the second drop are incredibly complicated. Overall, they all have the same final processing, which is just an OTT and taking out all the low end. First of all, I have the original bass, which is a vital, and I'm pretty much heavily abusing the inharmonic stretch option here in this first bass, giving it that specific sound. It has no extra processing beyond that. It's using a couple wavetables, but the main thing you should pay attention to is this inharmonic stretch, which is being increased with this LFO. And then this one is on the wavetable. This is a very long tempo, which I will actually show you. I go in here. I have that LFO on the first oscillator's wavetable position quite long because over time, that's going to change and therefore give a different sound every single time that bass hits. So what I have that going through, or I have it going through one vocodex and then another. The difference between those two is they're almost identical, but basically, first of all, they both have this, they both have the bandwidth all the way down, but this bottom one has the modulator pitch shift turned down, and the top one has a modulator pitch shift turned up, and then the main one is going in a little higher than full volume, and then the secondary vocoded ones are going in at slightly less volume. This envelope controller is just to make sure it doesn't ring out too much, so it has no release time, and that's controlling this fruity balance, and that's going through 3 OTTs and a fat rack, taking out all the low end, and then that's going into a serum effects just to give it some wideness, and that is being paired with the first chord through a MIDI out out, which is going into a resonator and just a saw, and then this original patch coming out of this EQ right here. So with most of the processing is going into the resonator and this vocoder. This vocoder has the modulator pitch shift turned up a little bit, and those are both not only going into the serum effects by themselves, but also a delayed. And those are both going into the serum effects by themselves to give that melodic character to the sound, and they're also parallel processing into a delay sounding like this, just to give it some wideness. And then that's all going into an EQ. This is taking out some of the resonance here. If I put that back, it sounds a little harsh at certain times. That's going into an OTT and another final EQ, taking out all the low and just shaving up the sound a little bit. And then once again, that's all going into the OTT effect. The next one is this bass here, which is using the same MIDI out. I think I have almost identical processing on this one. Whenever you see this sort of a vocoder and resonator combo, that is the color part of the color bass. And I don't think any of these have super saws, just normal saws, because I thought it sounded better. And that's just using this prism wavetable. And the main thing that's happening here is, and the EQ and the phaser are just giving it some movement. Same with this low pass cutoff. And then I once again have a very long 16 bar LFO. So every time it hits, it has a completely different sound. And then that's being both vocoded and resonated after, of course, going through 3 OTTs and a fat rack, and then shaping up the sound a bit, taking out all the low end and whatnot, typical stuff. This vocoder has the modulated pitch shift up a little bit, and then that's going through OTT, hyperdimension, final EQ shaping. Next up, pretty much the same thing. This is a duplicate of that first patch, except I have it plucking a lot more severely. So literally the same patch, just with a different groove and, higher pluck. Together those sound like this. One thing I like about the fact that I vocoded this is that it kind of gives it a sort of melody at this part, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Next one, this right here. I'm going to silence the resonator and vocoder first here. So this is the original patch. Once again, doing pretty much the exact same thing, just normal wavetable, inharmonic stretch on the duplicated version of the wavetable at -3 octaves, and that is parallel processed through a vocodex. This one I once again have the bandwidth all the way down, and I have the pitch modulator all the way up this time. This P controller is just to modulate. This P controller is just to control the volume of this vocoded one because it rang out a little bit, so I had to make sure that didn't happen. That's going through 3 OTTs, fat rack, shaping with an EQ, taking out all the low end, and then that's being parallel processed with a resonator layer and a vocoder layer, which I'll actually go over later because first of all, that's going through a spectral gate, which I already mentioned how that worked earlier. So yeah, more EQ shaping. And then there is a resonator layer coming in as well. And then this vocoder layer, which I'm actually vocoding super square, I guess, this time instead of a super saw, just because I wanted a bit of a different sound. That's all going into another EQ for shaping, serum effects for some hyperdimension, and then that's being parallel processed with this extra one, which is a crystallizer, and then this kilohertz stereo just to turn the width down a little bit, giving you that kind of sound. Next up, second to last one, which is sort of paired with this bass up here. This is probably one of the simplest ones here. It's just a very typical, PU type sound. Once again, wavetable, duplicated wavetable with inharmonic stretch on it, and then I'm creating a PU sound with it as a multi-band compression on it. That PU sound is made by just putting a sharp envelope on the pitch of your oscillators, and then I also have the long LFO on the wavetable just so it sounds different every time it hits, which is also over here. So it has some variation. And then finally, I have this sort of growl thing. And I just have 2 pretty growly wavetables being controlled by this LFO here and the inharmonic stretches on them slightly, some OTT, and then it's being vocoded with this thing here, which is just a saw wave. And I have the bandwidth not all the way down to 0, but just enough to get that kind of effect, and turning the modulator pitch shift up a little bit, 3 OTTs, fat rack, EQ shaping, taking out all the low end. That's going into a serum effects, give it some wideness, OTT, more EQ shaping, just to finish off the sound. And altogether, those sound like this. And then I just have that happening twice. Going into here, where I have the basses themselves, and I have those all rendered out. And I have parallel processing with a reverb here. I'm actually going to turn the output of the original one all the way off just so you can hear the reverb. I think I had this reverb before. Yeah, I mentioned it in the second half of the first drop. So I just have that reverb duplicated here. And on the original one, first of all, I have a fuse compressor, which is just a multi-band compressor on the original input. And then I have a Fruity P controller going negative of the actual sound. So when the sound is its quietest is when the P controller is at its highest. And that is controlling the mix of this reverb here. And then once again, you know, when the higher reverb gets turned down, the lower reverb gets turned up. And then I'm controlling that with this automation clip here. Putting that back with the original one. If I play this whole section without that reverb, it just sounded a little empty to me, so reverb. It sounds ever so slightly better in my opinion. And then for my transition over here into the second half of the second drop, I have a volume just on the only bass that's playing right here, the spectral growl that I have. And then that is going into the second drop, which is my favorite drop of the entire song, just because of one bass I made. So first of all, going over the drums, I think I'm using almost all the same drum samples, besides this here, which is just a clap layer to make my snares a little bit, I guess, wider, more full. The flow of these drums will make sense in a second into the actual sound design itself. This bass right here is arguably my favorite that I've ever made, just because of how full it is. Now, this is the processing for that bass. As you can see, it is incredibly complicated, so I'm gonna have to take a while to go over these. First of all, I have the flow of the basses, and then this one is a slight variation of that. I have pretty much all the audio samples following that flow, which, as you can see, they're just kind of cut up where they need to be cut up. Anyways, going over the first part, these first two, these have no processing on them. They are just sort of a noise layer, because I wanted this specific bass to have quite a bit of energy, and, you know, where there's noise, there's energy, right? Actually, let me turn these effects all the way off. So I guess this is how I decided what the flow of this part was going to be. And at this point, I just decided to layer a bunch of random crap that I could find. So I have the snare roll next, which is just a couple different parts of this AU5 snare roll. And then on that, I'm taking out all the lows and the highs because I just wanted the fundamental, putting that through a transient shaper just to make it more snappy. A compressor, because I guess it was a little too snappy. Ton of distortion, because I wanted to bring out some extra harmonics. And then making sure it was completely mono with this ozone imager. So far, it sounds like this. And then next up, I have these sort of percussion textural things. And then this one, which is just a clock. And then that is going through a snap heap to get that watery sound with all these dispersers. And then that is going into this right here, the main element of which is this effector, which has the delay on, and I'm turning the tempo of that down over time. That's starting off with this transient shaper to make sure I'm getting all the transients out properly. That is then going through a compressor to make sure it's not too loud. That's going through a kilohertz gate, because it was like ringing out a little bit too much, and then a very short reverb to give it some width. Now, so far, it sounds like this. And then paired with these crashes and whatnot up here, I have more noisy stuff just in the form of some risers and whatnot. Next, I have this heavily distorted vinyl noise, which, you know, just distortion on it. And then I'm taking out most of the low end, just leaving this kind of stuff, so I could add some extra texture. Then I have some birds and wind chimes. I have just a bird sample and some wind chime samples, because I thought they would sound cool, and I was right, they did. Ozone imager to make them completely mono, because they were kind of like off to the right or the left or something like that. And then I have a kilohertz ensemble to give it some stereo width, taking out all the low end. And then finally, I'm putting some melodic elements in there. First of all, I have this bell here. Basically, the way to make these sort of bells is to take a sine wave and just start adding random harmonics, and it makes this pretty cool metallic type sound. So I have that plucked, and then these are panning left and right opposite of each other, and that's going through an OTT, playing the chord for this specific sound, and then that is going through a frequency shifter at negative 237. That is being layered with yet another one of these. This time I put some hyperdimension on it. No effects other than that. Playing the exact same MIDI, playing together, they sound like this. And And then I have this thing, which is just pretty much every bell sound I have playing through a phase plant granulator. And those are shifting up and down in pitch. They're going left and right. Their timing is changing over time. I have some OTTs on it that I tried my best to create, and a high pass. And this is just turning it down a bit. And what it does is creates the Minecraft like XP picking up sound almost perfectly, which I thought was really cool. So I layered that with those bells, since they're all like bell sounds. And then I have the final part, which is, I guess, the most important, this growler right here. But basically what I've got going on is I'm using a wavetable, you know, and this LFO right here is scrolling through the wavetable. And then layered with that, I have another prism wavetable. That's going through 3 OTTs, a fat rack, EQ, and then going through a hyperdimension to make it stereo wide. So far, overall, we are getting this kind of sound if I just turn all of these on. And then since I'm a psychopath, I have those all going into one patch. That's going into a resonator, which is on a square wave instead of a saw wave this time. And that's being high passed, of course, taking all the low end. And then a vocoder, which is also being high passed. I'm taking some of the frequencies out here and a low pass just to make sure it wasn't so powerful in the high end. Turning this on finally. And through that vocoder is just a super saw, you know, very typical. And I'm playing with the modulator pitch shift of the vocodex just to give it some more interesting sounds with this automation clip right here. And then that is being processed along with the original sound, the dry sound, into this processing right here. I have a mid-side EQ, a fuse compressor just because I wanted it to sound better. I have a high pass taking out all the sub information, and then I'm dampening the high end a little bit. And then this fruity balance is being controlled by this automation clip right here, which establishes the flow of the bass. And on top of that, I am messing with a Valhalla Supermassive so I can make it extra wide. And then on top of that, I have a sub bass that I created, which is just a couple saw waves in which I've taken out the first couple harmonics. And then I have bend plus and bend minus on both of them. This one's at -3, it's at 16 unison. This one's at -2, it's at 16 unison. And then I have a just normal saw wave at -3. Those are going through full distortion, and I'm boosting the low end a bit. And that's going into here, where I have the high end being taken out. I have a mid-side EQ to make sure it's not too stereo wide, and then the volume here. So it's following the same volume as, you know, everything else. And it sounds all cool and whatnot. So it's just super wide, super beefy type bass. And then this is just playing a different chord. Moving on, made out of the weirdest samples I could find. I once again have to decipher my processing here. That might take a little bit, but I'll figure it out. Okay, so what have we got going on? First of all, I have the sub bass. Once again, this is the exact same sub bass as before with almost identical processing. This fruity balance is off, but it has a fuse compressor and that same EQ to make sure there's not any high end going on. Next up, I have this, which is a vital bass. I'm using a couple of wavetables here. First of all, 3 OTTs, fat rack. Actually don't know where this, yeah, this is getting routed through here. There's no extra processing on that besides those there. So I'm gonna route this here so I can actually figure out what's going on because I have no clue. First of all, I have this LFO on both of the volumes. It says I have it on something else. Oh, I have it on this phaser right here. I have another LFO on the pitch to give it some kick. That's for both oscillators. And then this second oscillator here, which is kind of the main one that's going on. I have the Atlantis wavetable. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but this is kind of the main wavetable I use for growls. And I have this LFO on the inharmonic stretch, but then I have a bend, either plus or minus on it. I don't exactly know, but that keeps it pretty tonal. It just now sounds a bit more gritty. I don't know how I did this, but I was somehow able to make the plucking more plucky over time. And same thing is going on up here with the square wave type deal, except I have, you know, the random amplitude on it, so it sounds all metallic and whatnot. That's going into a phaser, which I have going up over time. And then that's going into 3 OTTs and a fat rack. And that's getting layered with a ton of weird stuff. First of all, we have a snare, in which I have the pogo all the way down. So it gives that really weird sound. And then that has a snap heap on it. This is the disperser snap heap. So that gives it that sort of pew sound. And then I just decided to start layering a bunch of weird sounds with it. So I found this glitch sound effect from AU5 once again. And I kind of chopped it up randomly and layered it in there. And I quite recently downloaded and sort of sorted all of my Foley effects. So I used some Foley in there to give it some extra texture. That has a kilohertz distortion on it, a very large frequency shifter, pitching it down quite a bit. Serum effects, I'm not sure what's happening here. Oh, it's just like a volume shaper. And then a P controller, which is going to be used later. That's what it sounds like now. And then that also has this one right here, just to give it some extra groove. And that's being layered with this Caval water effect. Those are all being put through this processing. So we have a lot of texture in this sound. Going through a resonator, which has some EQ shaping on it, and a hyperdimension, and also a vocoder, where I have the modulator pitch shift all the way down because I wanted to have a kind of deeper tone, which is more accentuated by taking all the high end from that area. Instead of using a super saw, I just have sine waves, so it has a deeper kind of watery character to it. And then that is all going into this here, which, you know, it's got a mid-side EQ on it, a fused compressor, and it also has a Valhalla supermassive whose reverb I'm turning down over time. The supermassive because it's transitioning from this bass over here, which has quite a bit of reverb on it. And then once again, that's being layered with the sub bass. And then the next one, I think I used snares again. Once again, got to decipher my processing. It's pretty much all the same every time, but I have this arpeggio here, which is based off the chord that's supposed to be playing at this point. What I've got here is, first of all, another one of those bells, which is the same thing every time, just sine wave with a bunch of harmonics. That's being layered with, I think, the exact same thing, except duplicated. So this one also has an octave lower one, and that's going through a frequency shifter, which is pitched up. Together, those sound like this. And then I have a snare sample, which is being arpeggiated as well. Oh, this is just like a trap snare. All those together sound like this. As soon as I put that snare in, I knew I was going to do some weird stuff with this area. So then naturally, of course, since it's a dubstep bass, I put more snares. You know, as one does when making a dubstep bass that once again has these 10 dispersers on it. So it doesn't sound so much like a snare, giving it that more pew sound. Next, I have these sort of textural little bits right here, which are going through the exact same thing. I believe these are snaps, actually. I turn these off. Yep. Once again, dubstep bass, I'm using snaps and the snares. Don't you dare tell me this is normal sound design. And then I have this thing right here, which, you know, it sure is a thing. I think it's, yeah, this is just a bunch of water samples, mainly pretty much basically just white noise. They're being plucked, put through a ton of distortion and those 10 dispersers. It's going through an OTT and taking out all the low end with a EQ. And then this shape right here, because I wanted to make it sound really weird. So this shape is controlling the kilohertz frequency shifter that I have over here. And then I have another bass as well, just as like the lowest layer. EQ on that just to take out most of the high end and all of the low end. Just got a 3 OTTs, fat rack, hyperdimension on it. And yeah, once again, these Atlantis wavetables. And I'm just creating a pluck. These are on all the volumes and these are also on the wavetable positions. It's also on the smear here, which is basically just a high pass. It's also got some distortion on it. And then I have the sub bass. Anyways, going on with that, and that's once again going through resonator, high pass, vocoder. I don't think this is moving at all. It's just like slightly up a little bit, the modulator pitch shift, another high pass. The thing that's actually being vocoded, yeah, it's just another super saw. It's the same one before with the 16 unison. So yeah, I made all that with a couple snares. And then over here, pretty much the same thing, except slightly different automation clips shape for that frequency shifter and different chord, of course. I think I forgot to mention the difference with this one as well, which is also exactly the same, whereas just a different chord. Another thing I'm doing with these specific chords is that I have the chord changing ever so slightly, so it just plays a little bit of a melody. And then finally, for my very last thing, gotta once again decipher this. Luckily, it's all in one pattern here. So first of all, I have this phase plant and serum pad here. I think this right here is every bell I have. It's the exact same thing as the Minecraft XP sound, except it just doesn't have anything on the pitches here. So it's playing something actually consistent, and that's being layered with, I think it's supersaw, yeah, 16 unisons, taking out some of the high end. The volume is slightly lower. Together those sound like that. And then I have this backing bass, and then this is just a bunch of random amplitudes on some wavetables being controlled by this over time. 3 OTTs, fat rack, pretty basic processing. And then I have the sub bass, of course, same thing as before. This backing bass has a hyperdimension on it to give it some wideness, and then taking out a lot of the high end because it was just so harsh. And then the main thing, which is this piano, it's not only playing a couple chords, but also a bit of a melody, which is playing a interesting harmony. I don't actually know what this is called, but you know. And then I have this piano arpeggio just going down. And then on the second half, and that is going through OTT, Valhalla Supermassive to make it super wide and reverb, and then just EQ shaping. Then I have that going into a bunch of processing, just making sure it's not too loud, kind of dampening the sound a bit. Also EQ shaping. This pad and this backing bass are being vocoded together. They also have an OTT on them, and then I'm messing with the modulated pitch shift a little bit. I don't think this EQ does anything anymore, and then I have this for the volume because it rang out a little too long. And those are the basses for the second drop. Going back over here, you can see they're right here, you know. And those are all going into a patcher, just a mid-side EQ. Either way, I believe the last part that is worthy of mentioning for this section is these kind of mastering EQ effects, because I wanted the second half of the first drop, because it has that one bass, to have a lot more impact. So as we're getting into the second half of the second drop from the first half of the second drop, I have the volume going down. I have the stereo separation going down as well. So it's getting more mono. I did have a high pass, but then I have a slight low pass, just taking out a little bit of the high end, giving it that sort of transitionary sound. And yeah, that's it for the second drop. And now for the outro. So first and foremost, I use the splash sound effect as a transition from the last drop to the outro, and put all of the wind and kind of water ocean sound effects just as a padding layer, so it wasn't so dry, I guess. Then I got my sub bass here, which is just a respace. This second envelope is on the gain for this compressor, just to give it some extra pluck, and then it has some release on it. It's got no other effects beyond that. And then for the chord progression for this part, I took the transitionary chords from the break and just reversed it. So instead of going from that D chord progression to the C chord progression, it's going backwards from the C chord progression, which is the drop 2 chord progression, back to the D chord progression, which is the original one from the intro. So that chord progression is here in the first 16 bars, just backwards. And then it's going into the D chord progression from the very start of the song. And I've also got it a bit stylized by using the FL Studio strum feature. This one right here. I kind of use it individually on each chord just to make sure I was getting the exact sound that I wanted, and then moving around individual notes just as I saw fit. I also did some transitionary notes, like these ones in particular. And then at the very end, this second chord over here, this one would have been one that was kind of in key, but I wanted it to be kind of dissonant going into the very end of the song, so I did this kind of thing. And then that goes down to what is probably the actual root note of the first chord progression, which is just this C note. And so instead of just playing this entire chord, I wanted it to kind of, you know, because I thought that was cool. So that's the entire piano section. Yeah, I'm using a flex piano, the grand piano, because it's free. And then I have that going through some processing. I think I already mentioned this. I don't know for sure. I'm just going to go over it anyways. So I've got an ozone imager, making it a bit more mono, some OTT, this fresh air just to turn up the high end a bit. I think this bass lane is turning the width of the low end down just some extra bit. And then EQ just to boost this kind of 1200 hertz area. That's going into a dimension expander, and then another EQ. It doesn't look like it's doing anything, so there's no point in that being there. But that is is parallel processed with a reverb, which is a delay, a fruity reverb, and then a crystallizer, which is going through a second reverb. This crystallizer is being high passed and taking out the highs just ever so slightly. The normal fruity reverb is pretty much the same thing, just taking out all the lows and a lot of the high end, and then the delay is pretty much the exact same thing, just less severe and also a little bit less loud. That's going through a fruity balance just in case I wanted to control volume, and then an EQ just to boost some of this 4000 hertz area, and that is going through a mid-side EQ to make sure there's no stereo width in the very sub-bass low area. That's then going through a kilohertz compressor to make sure the volume doesn't blast out too much, and I'm boosting the high end just a little bit extra at the very end. And then I have this pad here, which is playing the exact same chord progression, except it's a different patch. So what I've got here is just a bunch of instrument samples that I found in my my extensive library of sounds in this section over here. And I just kind of dragged and dropped a bunch of them into these granulators. So as you can see, I've got like piano sounds, I've got some pluck sounds, I got like a flute sound in here, some bells. Up here I even have like horn stabs and whatnot, but then that's going through a dual delay. This low pass isn't doing anything, it's just if I ever wanted to use it again, I would have the option to low pass it if I felt like. And then an OTT patch I made and a high pass. That is then going through a Valhalla Supermassive, so I could reverb it out a bunch and taking out the high and low end because I wanted to make room for the high end of the piano so it could be heard more. And then just a mid-side EQ, taking out all the low end. And then beyond that, I also have this lead. It's not really a lead, it's just a pluck. In the final version of the song, I actually turned this down in volume quite a bit. So it's way louder than it should be. It's not even in the mixer right now. Just look at it for a second. This is effectively the same processing, just a Valhalla Supermassive for reverb, and this EQ taking out all the low end. And then we got this thing here. So I have just a normal wavetable pretty much, except what I've done is kind of that bell thing that I did before in the serums that I mentioned in the sound design for the second half of the second drop. I just went into the wavetable editor here and just went to the first sine wave and put a bunch of extra harmonics in there. I've got all this complicated processing. I got to figure out what's going on. 1 second. Just give me a second. Just give me a moment. Okay, so basically, this sample and hold is taking an input from this thing right here. This random amplitude is giving a sample to this sample and hold. So the sample and hold is taking in the sample from the random amplitude, and then it's being triggered every time this random one goes positive. So effectively, I'm sample and holding just randomness, and then the sample and hold is being put into this envelope, which is triggering the gain on my wavetable here. So effectively, what I'm getting is every time a note plays, it plays kind of at random because I wanted to have a randomized pluck here, but I didn't really know how to get that, so I had to figure it out. And that's once again playing the entire chord progression, and that's all that's happening in the outro. For the very end, I kind of just rendered everything out, and I guess I got rid of one of the water ambiances. And once again, this is quieter now. Oh, there's also this crash cymbal that I added in at the very end of the second drop. I believe that's it. I guess I'll go over the mastering now. I'm not exactly the greatest of all time at mastering my tracks, but then again, I don't really need to do much. I guess my mix is just up to par in my opinion. So what I've got here, first of all, mid-side EQ, taking out the sub side information, and then an ozone 9, doing some slight EQing here. Then I have a compressor. I was just kind of messing with this, and then just using this basically as a limiter for the whole song. And that is all that I've done for this track. So obviously you can listen to this song right now from the All By Myself EP, which is out right now, as I said. I'm going to be releasing track breakdowns for the rest of the songs over the next week or so about, so stay tuned for that. That's all for now. Listen to my EP. Peace.